On the night of September 14th, 2009, Daytona Beach, Florida pulsed with the easy rhythm of neon lights and ocean waves. Tourists sipped cocktails along the strip, bikers rolled down the highway, and families finished dinner by the shore. But somewhere between the laughter of diners and the crashing surf, a 20-year-old college student named Rachel Morgan vanished into thin air. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't running away. She was simply driving home after her late shift at the Harbor Cafe, uniform still faintly carrying the smell of coffee and steamed milk. A 15-minute trip, a quick phone call to her mother, and then silence. No car, no Rachel, just an empty road leading into darkness. The next morning, her purse appeared tossed along Cypress Creek, ID and belongings still inside. A haunting clue on a lonely roadside. Police swarmed the scene, volunteers combed the marshes, and a town held its breath. But as days turned into weeks, every lead crumbled. The only thing left was a mother's porch light glowing through the night, a beacon of desperate hope. Imagine that, your daughter promising to come home, and she never walks through the door. You leave the light on every evening, praying it guides her back. For 14 years, Patricia Morgan did exactly that. And all the while, the truth sat buried in evidence lockers and river mud, waiting for technology to catch up. This isn't just another missing person story. This is one of Florida's most haunting true crime cases, a mystery that twisted through rumor, heartbreak, and betrayal before DNA cracked it wide open. And tonight, we're pulling back the veil. Before we dive into this chilling case, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because the story you're about to hear will leave you questioning not only what happened that night, but who you can truly trust. The evening of September 14th, 2009, was ordinary in Daytona Beach, or at least it seemed so on the surface. The coastal highway was alive with the hum of cars, neon diners blinking, and the salty air drifting inland. But while the city pulsed with familiar energy, one young woman was unknowingly stepping into the final hours of her life. Rachel Morgan, just 20 years old, finished her night shift at the Harbor Cafe. Her hair was pulled back loosely, her uniform faintly carrying the smell of steamed milk and roasted coffee. It was close to 10:30 p.m. when she clocked out, thanked her coworkers, and stepped into the humid Florida night. The cafe's old jukebox hummed behind her as the door closed, its neon sign flickering as though foreshadowing what was about to come. Rachel slid into her Toyota Corolla, the silver paint catching faint reflections from the cafe's lights. She called her mother, Patricia, her voice tired but cheerful. "I'm heading home now. 15 minutes tops. I'll meet you on the porch." For Patricia, that phone call was a routine comfort, a daughter checking in, promising she'd be home soon. But as we know all too well in true crime cases, routine can shatter in an instant. The drive home was short, just a winding path past Cypress Creek and across a wooden bridge that groaned when cars passed. The road was lined with palm trees swaying gently in the humid breeze, their shadows stretching unnaturally beneath the dim yellow streetlights. It wasn't stormy. There was no rain. Just silence, broken only by the soft hum of Rachel's tires. Now, imagine yourself behind that wheel. You've just worked a long shift, your eyes tired, but your heart comforted by the thought of seeing family. You pass under a flickering streetlight, shadows dancing across your windshield. And then, a subtle movement. A truck idling somewhere in the distance, headlights off, just enough for you to sense another presence. Do you keep driving? Do you tell yourself it's nothing? That moment, so ordinary yet so eerie, is the moment Rachel never escaped. By 11 p.m., when Patricia glanced at the clock and her daughter still hadn't arrived, unease set in. She dialed Rachel's phone again and again, but each call went to voicemail. Midnight came, and with it a crushing weight in Patricia's chest. Something was wrong. Something had stolen her daughter from that 15-minute drive. The following morning confirmed her fears. An early jogger noticed a purse discarded by the roadside near Cypress Creek, less than a mile from the Harbor Cafe. Inside were Rachel's ID, keys, and a few personal belongings. It wasn't theft. It wasn't carelessness. It was a sign, a grim breadcrumb leading into darkness. Police rushed to the scene, yellow tape cutting across the lonely road. Investigators crouched near the purse, flashlights darting through grass wet with morning dew. The air smelled of damp earth and stagnant water, the silence broken only by the chatter of radios. Patricia stood nearby, her hands trembling, insisting that Rachel would never leave her belongings behind. "She's been taken," she repeated, her voice breaking. "Someone has her." Eights. The search began immediately. K-9 units traced the area, noses pressed to the ground along the creek's muddy banks. Volunteers, neighbors, church members, college students formed lines across the fields, their flashlights sweeping through weeds and abandoned sheds. Helicopters hovered overhead, their spotlights cutting into the darkness. The town had mobilized for one of the largest search efforts it had ever seen. Yet, with every passing hour, the sense of dread thickened. Cypress Creek swallowed secrets easily, its murky water reflecting the frantic lights of patrol cars. Boats scoured the water, but nothing emerged except debris, rotted logs, bottles, and a bicycle rusted into silence. The Toyota Corolla, Rachel's lifeline home, was nowhere to be found. As days turned into weeks, Daytona Beach transformed. Posters with Rachel's smiling face appeared on storefronts, gas stations, and lampposts. Local news ran nightly coverage, reporters standing near Cypress Creek, their voices heavy with speculation. Was it a kidnapping? A runaway? Or something far worse? In diners, in barbershops, in churches, one question circulated endlessly. Where is Rachel Morgan? Eights. For Patricia, the days blurred together. She barely slept, clinging to the phone in case it rang. Her home filled with volunteers and police officers, but also with silence, the kind of silence that eats away at hope. Every evening, she went outside, turned on the porch light, and sat waiting, her gaze locked on the empty driveway. It became her ritual, a beacon glowing through the night, a desperate message to her daughter. Come home. I'm waiting. But the driveway stayed empty. The purse was the only tangible clue, but it revealed almost nothing. There were no fingerprints except Rachel's. No tire tracks nearby. No eyewitnesses. Just the eerie absence of evidence, as though the earth itself had swallowed her whole. Psychologists often note that the early days of a disappearance are the cruelest. Families swing violently between hope and despair. Every ring of the phone is both salvation and heartbreak. Patricia felt this cycle daily, her body exhausted but her mind racing. She replayed that final call over and over, dissecting her daughter's last words, hunting for a hidden warning she might have missed. The community, too, began to fracture under the weight of unanswered questions. Some whispered about a dark pickup truck seen near the cafe that night, circling slowly as if waiting. Others muttered cruel theories, that Rachel had run away, maybe with a secret boyfriend. Rumors spread like wildfire, transforming the victim into a suspect in her own story. Patricia heard them, and each rumor cut like glass. She knew her daughter. Rachel was not reckless. Rachel was not a runaway. But the longer silence stretched, the louder the rumors became. And so, the image of Rachel Morgan began to shift, from a hopeful student with a bright smile to a haunting mystery. Her purse by Cypress Creek became a symbol, a chilling reminder that she had been there, and then she was gone. This is what makes true crime cases like Rachel's so haunting. They leave entire communities suspended between belief and denial, forcing families to hold on to hope while the rest of the world slowly turns away. But not everyone turned away. Patricia kept her vigil, the porch light glowing each night. Neighbors passed quietly, nodding but saying little. Some avoided the house altogether, unable to bear the grief it radiated. And through it all, the question lingered in the humid Florida air, thick as the ocean salt. What really happened to Rachel that night? The purse was only the beginning of a story that would unravel painfully over the next 14 years, through missed opportunities, cold case files, and finally, the shocking truth that modern DNA technology would reveal. But on that September night, all anyone knew was this: Rachel Morgan was gone, and nothing in Daytona Beach would ever feel the same again. Before we continue deeper into this chilling case, I want to hear from you. If you find stories like Rachel's important, if you believe in shining light on these true crime cases so families never have to suffer in silence again, drop a comment below. Type 1 if this video has meaning to you, or 0 if it doesn't. Your voice keeps these stories alive and ensures that victims like Rachel are never forgotten. The discovery of Rachel's purse was like a spark dropped into dry grass. It set Daytona Beach on fire with fear. Within hours of the report, police sealed off Cypress Creek. Yellow tape fluttered under the morning sun, and flashing blue lights painted the quiet waters in an unsettling glow. What had once been a lonely stretch of road transformed overnight into a crime scene watched by the entire town. K-9 units prowled the roadside, sniffing for a trail. Officers knelt by the muddy banks, lifting blades of grass, bagging fibers, searching desperately for anything the earth might reveal. Helicopters thumped overhead, their searchlights sweeping across treetops and rippling water. Onlookers gathered behind the barricades, whispers spreading through the crowd like wind through dry reeds. A college student had vanished on her way home. Her car was gone. Her purse left behind. The implications were terrifying. And then, the volunteers came. Hundreds of them. Men in reflective vests, mothers clutching flashlights, teenagers with boots too big for their feet. They formed lines, shoulders squared, combing the fields and marshes inch by inch. Some waded through knee-deep reeds, their lights catching the sheen of water snakes slipping away. Others pushed through abandoned barns and empty houses, calling Rachel's name into the silence. Imagine yourself there. The air thick with humidity, mosquitoes buzzing at your ears, your flashlight catching shadows that could be branches, or something worse. Every crunch of grass beneath your boots makes your heart pound, because you know you're not just looking for a lost girl. You're searching for proof of a nightmare. The Morgan family stood in the center of it all. Patricia barely spoke, her face hollow from sleepless nights. Michael, her husband, tried to appear steady, but neighbors noticed the way his hands shook whenever he lit a cigarette. And young Ethan, Rachel's 15-year-old brother, lingered on the sidelines, too young to grasp the full scope of the horror, but old enough to feel its weight pressing down. The search stretched on for days, then weeks. Patrol boats skimmed the Halifax River and Cypress Creek, their sonar scanning the depths for Rachel's silver Toyota Corolla. Divers plunged into black water, thick with mud, but surfaced with nothing more than rusted metal scraps. The car had vanished as if swallowed by the earth. Each failed sweep deepened the sense of futility. Meanwhile, rumors began to take root. Some whispered that Rachel had been kidnapped, forced into a truck that circled the harbor cafe that night. Others muttered crueler theories, that maybe she had chosen to run away, hiding a secret life no one had seen. In diners, at church pews, in barber shops, the town split into two camps: those who believed Rachel was a victim, and those who doubted her innocence. Patricia heard every rumor, each one carving another wound. She knew her daughter. Rachel wasn't reckless. She wasn't the kind to vanish willingly. But the longer the silence stretched, the more people filled the void with speculation. And in the cruelest twist, the victim became the subject of suspicion. The police, under pressure, held press conferences almost daily. Officers stood stiffly behind podiums, assuring the public that every lead was being pursued. They spoke of witness interviews, of vehicles being tracked, of tips being logged. But beneath their polished words, frustration was clear. There were no breakthroughs, no fingerprints, no clear suspects. Just the purse and a town drowning in fear. For the residents, Rachel's face became inescapable. Flyers plastered on grocery store windows. Her smile staring out from gas stations. Her eyes watching from the local paper's front page. To some, she was a daughter. To others, a stranger. But to everyone, she was a reminder that safety was fragile, that in the span of a 15-minute drive, normal life could collapse into one of the darkest true crime cases Florida had ever witnessed. As weeks slipped into months, the panic gave way to exhaustion. Volunteers dwindled, police scaled back, and the media shifted focus to fresher tragedies. Yet, in the Morgan household, time stood still. Patricia continued her ritual. Each dusk, she flicked on the porch light, its warm glow spilling onto the empty driveway. At first, it was a signal for Rachel. But soon, it became a symbol, a stubborn refusal to let her daughter's story vanish, a reminder to neighbors that justice was still waiting. The light became infamous in Daytona Beach. Some residents saw it as hope, a beacon against despair. Others found it haunting, even frightening, the way it glowed through the night like an unblinking eye. But no one could ignore it, just like no one could ignore Rachel's absence. The silence around Cypress Creek grew heavier with each passing season. The purse was bagged in evidence. The rumors faded into background noise. But Patricia sat on her porch swing every night, the light shining, staring at the road where she once expected her daughter to appear. It was in that silence, in that failure of answers, that the case slowly began to freeze. A cold fog settled over the investigation, one that would take 14 years and a revolution in forensic science to finally lift. And as we move deeper into Rachel Morgan's journey, ask yourself, how many other families are still waiting, still clinging to porch lights of their own, desperate for answers in their own true crime cases? Before we reveal how the investigation began to unravel, I want to hear from you. If you believe stories like Rachel's deserve to be told, if you want justice for families who wait in silence, type 1 in the comments right now. If not, type 0. Your response keeps these stories alive and ensures that victims like Rachel are never forgotten. Despite the massive search efforts, despite the flyers and flashing lights, the investigation into Rachel Morgan's disappearance soon collided with the limits of evidence. Police did recover fragments, small details that could have shifted the case early, but each one was brushed aside, filed away, or simply left to gather dust. The first detail came from a grainy ATM camera less than 100 yards from the Harbor Cafe. The footage, recorded around 10:20 p.m., the same time Rachel called her mother, captured a fleeting pair of headlights moving past the corner. Investigators believed the vehicle was a pickup truck, possibly dark green, matching a witness report from that night. The problem was clarity. The footage was blurred, washed in black and white, impossible to extract a license plate or even the make of the vehicle. At the time, police described it as helpful but inconclusive. For Patricia, that phrase was unbearable. She wanted to scream. Helpful meant something. To her, it meant her daughter was alive in that moment, passing through the same streets, shadowed by a stranger. Then came the whispers about a dark green pickup circling Harbor Cafe. A waitress recalled seeing it idle in the parking lot weeks before Rachel vanished. A mechanic mentioned repairing a similar truck for a man he didn't recognize. Residents claimed they spotted it near the beach in the days before the disappearance. But the stories were fragmented, inconsistent, and without names attached. The lead dissolved into speculation, another thread slipping through the cracks. The most haunting oversight, however, lay not in footage or rumor, but in a piece of physical evidence. Just 2 days after Rachel vanished, a jacket was found near Cypress Creek, mud-stained, soaked, abandoned in the brush less than 200 yards from where her purse had been discovered. Officers logged it, photographed it, and stored it. But in 2009, DNA testing was both limited and costly. Without clear bloodstains or visible signs of struggle, the jacket was deemed irrelevant. Probably unrelated, one report read. And so it was shelved. For Patricia, this revelation was devastating. To her, the jacket was not just fabric, it was proof. Proof that Rachel fought, that Rachel left something behind. She begged officers to test it, returning to the station again and again, her voice breaking, her pleas dismissed. Each time, the answer was the same. Too expensive, too uncertain, too weak a lead. This moment, more than any other, revealed the fracture between hope and bureaucracy. The family lived every second of absence like torture, while investigators lived by budgets, protocols, and what the technology of the time could offer. Between those two realities, the jacket remained sealed in a plastic bag, silenced for more than a decade. As the months passed, the leads stacked up like puzzle pieces with no picture. The ATM footage, too blurry. The green pickup, too vague. The jacket, too costly to test. Each thread was frayed, every possible answer deferred. And for the community, the shift was palpable. The frenzy of search parties dulled, the energy of volunteers waned, and Rachel's case slipped slowly into the chilling category that so many true crime cases eventually occupy. Unsolved, uncertain, unfinished. For Patricia, though, there was no such category. To her, there were no missed opportunities, only failures. She sat at home, staring at her porch light glowing across the driveway, consumed by the thought that the truth had been within reach, only to be overlooked. What haunted Daytona Beach most was not just Rachel's disappearance, but the gnawing possibility that someone, somewhere, had seen her final moments. That perhaps a driver on the road had noticed the green truck. That perhaps the ATM footage, enhanced with better technology, could have revealed the license plate. That perhaps the jacket carried the story in its threads all along. But those answers would not come in 2009, or 2010, or 2011. Instead, the investigation slowed to a crawl, each year burying Rachel deeper in silence. What remained were faded posters, unanswered questions, and the relentless ritual of a mother who refused to stop waiting. By the time the first anniversary of Rachel Morgan's disappearance passed, Daytona Beach had already moved forward. The neon signs still blinked along the strip, tourists still poured in for races and beaches, and life resumed its familiar rhythm. But inside the Morgan household, time remained frozen on September 14th, 2009. Every evening, Patricia Morgan flicked on the porch light at dusk. At first, it was a simple act of faith, a signal for her daughter. But as the years stretched on, the ritual became a symbol of defiance. Neighbors noticed the glow, steady and unwavering, night after night. To some, it was hopeful, to others, haunting, but to Patricia, it was necessary. She couldn't allow the darkness to swallow her daughter's name. Inside the home, grief carved deep fault lines. Michael, Rachel's father, went to work at the auto shop each day, returning with his shoulders heavy, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He rarely spoke of his daughter, but his silence was louder than words. Co-workers noticed him crying in the garage, hiding in the bathroom when memories overcame him. He carried his grief in private, as though keeping it buried might protect what little strength the family still had. Ethan, just 15 when his sister vanished, grew into a quiet shadow of himself. At the dinner table, he pushed food around his plate, rarely meeting his parents' eyes. At school, teachers described him as withdrawn, his assignments unfinished, his once bright demeanor muted. In the silence of his room, he began to write poems, simple verses scrawled into notebooks, letters to a sister who would never read them. For Patricia, each day was a cycle of waiting and pretending. She answered phone calls from detectives, attended prayer vigils, and endured the whispers of neighbors. But when the house grew quiet, she sat in Rachel's bedroom, untouched since the day she vanished. The bed remained made, the perfume still faint on the sheets, the bulletin board still pinned with her college schedule. Patricia would sit for hours, whispering into the emptiness, as though her daughter were listening from somewhere just beyond reach. The community's attention waned as the years dragged on. In the early days, dozens had joined candlelight vigils, filling the streets with prayers and flowers. By 2012, only a handful remained. The once bold headlines about Rachel's disappearance faded to small mentions buried in the back pages. For the world, she had become another name in a growing list of unsolved tragedies. For Patricia, the silence was unbearable. She often described it as screaming into an empty room, her voice echoing without answer. And then came another blow. In 2016, Michael Morgan died suddenly of a heart attack. Friends said he carried the weight of unanswered questions until the very end. At his funeral, Patricia stood silently beside his casket, clutching a photo of Rachel. It felt to her like burying two people at once, her husband and the future they had once shared. Michael's death left Patricia alone in her vigil, the porch light glowing each night for both her daughter and the man who had died waiting for answers. Ethan, by then in college, struggled with guilt. He avoided speaking of his sister, rarely mentioning her name to new friends. Yet late at night in his dorm room, he opened old photos, staring at images of beach days and childhood laughter before quickly snapping the laptop shut. It was too much, too heavy, as though lingering on her memory might consume him entirely. For Patricia, the cold years were a cruel contradiction. The world had forgotten, but she could not. Her home was a museum of memory, her porch a beacon of defiance, her heart a reservoir of grief. She fought not only the pain of absence but the indifference of time, a battle that seemed impossible to win. Rachel Morgan's case officially became a cold case during this period, filed away among hundreds of other unsolved tragedies in Florida. It was the fate of many true crime cases, boxed, cataloged, and shelved, while families were left with nothing but rituals and fading photographs. But Patricia never stopped. Each September 14th, she held a small memorial on the beach Rachel loved, releasing flowers into the waves. Each night, she turned on the porch light, refusing to let her daughter's name vanish into silence. What no one knew then was that in the darkness of those cold years, the evidence that would one day crack the case was already waiting, ignored, overlooked, sealed in a plastic bag deep in storage. By 2023, 14 long years had passed since Rachel Morgan vanished. Patricia's porch light still glowed every night, but to many in Daytona Beach, it had become a haunting backdrop rather than a beacon of hope. The case was officially classified as cold, another file collecting dust in the sheriff's archives. For the Morgans, it felt like the world had moved on, everyone except Patricia. Then came an unexpected ripple of change. That year, Florida launched a special funding program for cold case units, a hard-won victory by advocacy groups demanding that forgotten evidence be retested with advanced forensic technology. Among the thousands of cases in storage, Rachel Morgan's name surfaced for review. When Patricia received the call that her daughter's jacket, the mud-stained garment found near Cypress Creek back in 2009, would finally be tested, she nearly collapsed. For years she had begged, pleaded, and been ignored. Now, after so much silence, the chance for answers returned. "It's all I've ever asked," she whispered to reporters. "Test the jacket." Eights. Inside the forensic lab, technicians carefully unsealed the evidence bag. The fabric was still damp-stained, still caked with old mud. Under the sterile lights, every thread told a story that had been hidden for over a decade. This time, the technology was different. Instead of crude swabs and limited markers, experts used next-generation sequencing, capable of detecting profiles invisible to older methods. The results were explosive. Traces of Rachel's DNA were present, confirming the jacket had been hers. But there was more. A strong, clear male profile emerged, enough to compare against CODIS, the National DNA Database. Days later, the lab reported a match. The name was Brian Holloway. He was 45 years old, living quietly in St. Augustine, just an hour's drive from Daytona. In 2009, he had lived blocks from the Harbor Cafe. His record was checkered. Arrests for assault, bar fights, and domestic violence. He drove, at that time, an old dark green pickup truck. Suddenly, puzzle pieces that had seemed meaningless years ago locked into place. The blurry ATM footage, the witness who spoke of a green truck, the jacket abandoned by Cypress Creek. All roads led to Brian. The sheriff's office called it a watershed moment. Reporters called it a triumph of science. For Patricia, it was bittersweet. Relief that her daughter's story was finally moving forward. Rage that it had taken 14 years. "If they had tested it then," she said, clutching Rachel's photo, "my husband might still be alive to see this." Eights. As the news broke, Daytona Beach erupted. Headlines screamed, 2009 cold case cracked by DNA. Local television replayed Rachel's smiling photo next to Brian's mugshot from a 2007 bar fight. Residents stared in disbelief. Many recognized him. Some had hired him as an electrician. Others remembered his truck parked near the cafe. More chilling still, volunteers recalled that Brian had joined search parties in 2009, standing shoulder to shoulder with Rachel's grieving father, pretending to help, The sense of betrayal was overwhelming. To realize the suspected killer had walked among them, drank at the same bars, attended the same vigils, it struck the town like a lightning bolt. He patted Michael Morgan on the back. One neighbor told reporters, her voice shaking. He comforted a father while hiding the truth. 8. Police immediately reopened the case, reconstructing Rachel's final hours with fresh eyes. They pulled old maps from storage, pinned photos across the walls of the cold case unit, and circled Brian's name in red. Detectives interviewed his former neighbors, co-workers, and bar acquaintances. Slowly, a disturbing portrait emerged. A man with a violent temper, a history of harassment, and access to the very roads Rachel drove that night. For the community, the revelation was both a shock and a mirror. It reminded them how fragile trust could be. The man fixing your wiring, nodding politely in the grocery store, could be the same man hiding in the shadows of a roadside. In the world of true crime cases, this duality, the mask of the ordinary concealing the monstrous, is what keeps people awake at night. Even as the investigation gained traction, Patricia was torn between vindication and torment. She thought of her late husband, Michael, who had died waiting for answers. She thought of Ethan, who carried guilt for moving away. And she thought of Rachel, her daughter's smile now plastered on screens once more. "She's finally being heard," Patricia said softly at a vigil, "but at such a cost." 8. The shockwaves extended far beyond Daytona Beach. Across Florida, families of missing loved ones saw new hope. If a jacket overlooked for 14 years could unlock justice, then perhaps their evidence, too, carried silent truths. Advocacy groups rallied, calling Rachel's story proof that investment in forensic science was not just about technology, it was about humanity, about refusing to let families suffer in endless silence. In the Morgan home, the porch light continued to glow. But now, it wasn't just a symbol of waiting. It was a torch of justice, signaling that the tide had turned. For the first time in 14 years, Patricia didn't feel entirely alone in the darkness. The truth had begun to surface, and it carried a name: Brian Holloway. And as the investigation zeroed in on him, Daytona Beach braced for the next chapter. What had once been a whisper in the shadows was now a storm in the headlines. The town was forced to look back at 2009 with new eyes, wondering how they had lived beside a man capable of such horror. The story of Rachel Morgan was no longer just a tragedy. It was a reminder of persistence, of science, and of how easily evil hides in plain sight. It was one of those rare true crime cases where silence finally gave way to truth, though far too late for the family who had borne its weight the longest. Before we dive deeper into the unraveling of Brian's secrets and the shocking discoveries still to come, I want to hear from you. If you believe Rachel's story matters, if you want justice for families who keep porch lights burning in the dark, drop a comment below. Type 1 if this story has meaning to you, or 0 if it doesn't. Your voice ensures these victims are never forgotten. With Brian Holloway identified as the prime suspect, investigators turned back to the terrain that had haunted Daytona Beach for over a decade. Among locals, the Halifax River had always carried whispers, murky waters where secrets might lie hidden. Back in 2009, police had swept the area with outdated sonar, but the technology of the time could not penetrate the river's thick bed of mud and silt. Nothing surfaced, and the search moved on. Now, in 2023, with new imaging tools and fresh determination, the cold case unit returned. On a gray March morning, the river was still and glassy, the sky heavy with clouds. A dive team coordinated with sonar operators, scanning section after section near the harbor cafe, retracing the path Rachel might have taken on her last drive home. Within hours, the monitor flickered with something unusual. A shadowed shape, distorted but unmistakable. A vehicle. Divers dropped into the frigid current, beams of light cutting through darkness. Moments later, their radios crackled with confirmation. It was a car, buried deep in silt, corroded but intact. Word spread quickly. By the time the tow cables tightened and the rusted frame began to rise from the water, a small crowd had gathered on the banks. Cameras rolled, neighbors stood in silence, and reporters jostled for position. As the dripping vehicle emerged, its silver paint corroded by 14 years underwater, everyone knew what it was. Michael Morgan's Toyota Corolla. For Patricia, the news was crushing and clarifying all at once. For years, she had imagined countless scenarios: her daughter's car abandoned on a roadside, dismantled in a chop shop, lost forever. Now, reality was worse. The Corolla had been there all along, submerged in the very river that cut through her hometown. When investigators pried open the doors, the silence grew heavier. Inside lay human remains, fragments of bone scattered on the back seat, nylon rope tangled around an arm. Alongside them were personal items. A rusted bracelet Patricia had given Rachel for her 18th birthday, a waterlogged notebook, and a shattered cell phone. It was as though the car itself had preserved the truth, waiting for someone to listen. The remains were sent immediately for analysis. Forensic anthropologists worked through bone fragments, clothing fibers, and water damage. Within weeks, DNA confirmed what Patricia had both feared and expected. The remains belonged to Rachel Morgan. The announcement shook Florida. For 14 years, Rachel had been a missing person, her story a mystery whispered about in coffee shops and church basements. Now, she was no longer missing. She was a victim of murder. And the crime scene, the car, the rope, the bones, was undeniable. Daytona Beach reacted with a mix of heartbreak and fury. Vigils sprang up along the riverbank where the Corolla was raised. People left flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. "Rachel, we brought you back into the light." Some mourned the confirmation of death. Others demanded to know how such crucial evidence could have lain hidden for so long in the heart of their town. For Patricia, the moment was both an ending and a cruel new beginning. She stood in Rachel's untouched bedroom when police delivered the DNA confirmation, clutching a framed photo of her daughter. "You're home now," she whispered. "You finally came back." Her grief was raw, but the certainty carried weight. No more speculation. No more cruel rumors about running away. Rachel's story now had a truth carved in evidence. The discovery of the Corolla was more than just closure. It was a catalyst. For investigators, it tied together every overlooked thread. The jacket with Brian's DNA. The green pickup truck seen that night. The phone records placing him near the cafe. And now, a car dumped in the river, with Rachel's remains bound by rope. The picture was clear. Rachel Morgan had not vanished by choice. She had been ambushed, restrained, and silenced. Cases like Rachel's remind us why true crime cases grip entire communities. They expose not only the brutality of a single act, but also the fragility of trust, the knowledge that someone capable of horror can hide in plain sight. In Daytona Beach, people once again gathered outside the harbor cafe, the last place Rachel was seen alive. This time, they weren't searching in fields or calling her name. They were standing in silence, candles flickering, staring at the photo of a young woman who should have grown older, but never would. And as the Corolla was wheeled into evidence storage, its rusted frame dripping river water onto the concrete, one truth was undeniable. The silence of 14 years had finally broken. The river had given up its secret, and Rachel's voice, lost for so long, was heard again. The discovery of Rachel's Corolla and the confirmation of her remains transformed the case from speculation into certainty. Investigators no longer spoke of a disappearance. They spoke of murder. Every thread of evidence pointed to Brian Holloway, the quiet electrician who had once lived just blocks from the Harbor Cafe. For weeks, police built their case meticulously. They combed through Brian's past, cross-checking his phone records from September 14th, 2009. The data placed him at the cafe when Rachel left work, and again near the Halifax River when her car disappeared beneath its waters. Witness statements about the green pickup resurfaced, now carrying weight they hadn't 14 years earlier. Each piece fit neatly into a puzzle that had long seemed impossible to solve. By October 2023, the sheriff's office was ready. An arrest warrant was signed, charging Brian with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and unlawful restraint. The operation was planned with precision. At dawn, a task force surrounded his mobile home in St. Augustine. They cut the power, sealed the road, and positioned officers at every angle. Neighbors awoke to the sound of a loudspeaker. "Brian Holloway, come out with your hands up." Minutes later, he appeared in the doorway, disheveled, barefoot, and blinking against the flashing lights. He didn't resist. Officers moved in swiftly, cuffing his wrists as cameras clicked and red-blue sirens washed the small street in color. For the first time in 14 years, the man behind Daytona's darkest mystery was in custody. What shocked the community most was not just his arrest, it was the memory of his mask. In 2009, Brian had joined the search parties for Rachel. He had stood shoulder to shoulder with volunteers, handed out sandwiches, even patted Michael Morgan on the back, telling him, "We'll find her." That gesture, once seen as kindness, was now reinterpreted as cruelty of the worst kind. He wasn't just hiding in plain sight, he was hiding inside their grief. As news of the arrest spread, Daytona Beach erupted in disbelief. Outside Harbor Cafe, where Rachel had last been seen, locals gathered to talk. "I let him fix the wiring in my house," one woman said, tears in her eyes. "I trusted him around my kids." Another man shook his head, staring at the newspaper headline. "All this time, the killer was with us." 8. The sense of betrayal was visceral. The man they had once considered a quiet, if slightly odd, neighbor was now accused of murdering a young woman whose face had haunted the town for over a decade. It was a reminder that the line between ordinary and monstrous can be terrifyingly thin, a theme that runs through many true crime cases, and one that chills communities long after justice is served. In Patricia Morgan's home, the television broadcast Brian's arrest live. She watched the screen with trembling hands, clutching her daughter's photo. Seeing his face again, she remembered him from the search groups, remembered how he had looked her in the eye and promised to help. The thought made her stomach turn. "He knew," she whispered. "All along, he knew." 8. For investigators, the arrest marked a rare moment of triumph in a 14-year nightmare. But they also knew the hardest work still lay ahead, building an airtight case for trial. The evidence was strong: DNA on the jacket, the rope inside the car, the phone records, but they had to prepare for every counterargument, every technicality the defense might exploit. Meanwhile, the community wrestled with its own questions. How had they missed the signs? How had a man with a violent record slipped back into obscurity, living quietly for years while a family mourned in silence? The realization unsettled everyone, making neighbors glance at each other with suspicion, wondering what other secrets might lurk behind familiar faces. That October day, as Brian Holloway was led into custody under the glare of cameras, Daytona Beach was no longer the same town it had been 14 years earlier. The innocence was gone. Trust had been fractured. And for Patricia, the porch light that had once been a beacon of hope now burned with a new meaning. A light of justice, proof that the darkness could not hide forever. When Brian Holloway was finally brought to trial, Daytona Beach held its breath. For 14 years, Rachel Morgan's story had been a mystery, a cold case that lingered in whispers and unanswered prayers. Now, at last, it was laid bare in a courtroom where truth and justice collided under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. On the first day, the courthouse overflowed. Reporters lined the steps, cameras jostled for position, and residents packed the gallery, desperate to witness the reckoning. Patricia Morgan walked in, clutching her daughter's photo, her eyes sunken with grief yet blazing with determination. Beside her, Ethan sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, carrying the weight of both son and surviving sibling. Across the aisle, Brian Holloway entered in an orange prison jumpsuit. His hair was cropped short, his face pale under the weight of attention. He sat hunched, occasionally glancing around the room, his expression detached, as though the gravity of the moment belonged to someone else. The prosecution wasted no time. In their opening statement, they laid out the evidence with precision. Eights, the DNA profile pulled from Rachel's jacket, an undeniable match to Brian. The Toyota Corolla, retrieved from the Halifax River, containing rope bound around Rachel's remains. Cell tower data placing Brian's phone near the Harbor Cafe at the exact time Rachel vanished, and again near the river where the car was dumped. This is not speculation, the prosecutor declared, voice firm. This is proof that Brian Holloway kidnapped, restrained, and murdered Rachel Morgan on the night of September 14th, 2009. Eights. The defense countered with a different narrative. They argued the DNA could have been transferred through casual contact. Brian had lived near the cafe. They said his DNA on the jacket didn't mean he killed anyone. They questioned the reliability of old phone records and claimed the prosecution lacked a direct witness to the crime. Holloway's attorney insisted, there is no smoking gun. There is only assumption built on coincidence. Eights. But as testimony unfolded, the weight of evidence pressed down like a storm. Witnesses took the stand. A former waitress described seeing Brian's dark green pickup circling the Harbor Cafe that week. A neighbor recalled the same truck parked outside his home, sometimes covered with a tarp. A bartender testified that Brian was known for sudden bursts of violence, his temper flaring over trivial slights. Then came the most emotional testimony. Forensic experts walked the jury through images of the Corolla being lifted from the river, mud streaming from its frame. They showed photos of Rachel's bracelet, rusted but still intact, a relic of her 18th birthday. Patricia sobbed quietly as the courtroom stared at the evidence. Each image was not just proof, it was pain, crystallized in front of 12 strangers tasked with judgment. Throughout the proceedings, Brian sat motionless. He rarely reacted, even when his name was tied to each piece of evidence. His silence was not seen as calm, but as emptiness, a chilling void in a room heavy with grief. The closing argument sealed the divide. The prosecution reminded the jury that coincidences do not bind a young woman with rope and sink her car in a river. The defense clung to doubt, urging the jury to avoid convicting a man on circumstantial evidence alone. When the jury retired, tension filled every corner of the courthouse. Hours ticked by like days. Patricia clutched Rachel's photo. Ethan held her hand, and residents whispered prayers under their breath. Then, after less than 4 hours, the jury returned. The foreperson rose, voice steady. We, the jury, find the defendant, Brian Holloway, guilty of first-degree murder. Eights! The courtroom erupted. Gasps, sobs, and muffled cries filled the air. Patricia covered her face with her hands, tears streaming, as Ethan whispered, "We did it. She's been heard." The judge's gavel struck, sentencing Brian to life without the possibility of parole. As Holloway was led away in handcuffs, he offered no words, no apology. Only the image remained. A man who once passed as a good neighbor, now revealed as a predator who had stolen a daughter, shattered a family, and haunted a community for more than a decade. Outside, the courthouse steps filled with people holding candles and signs that read, "Justice for Rachel." The verdict was more than a legal decision. It was a communal release. A burden 14 years in the making finally lifted, even if the pain remained. Rachel Morgan's trial became one of Florida's most significant true crime cases of the decade, a chilling reminder that time does not erase truth. It proved that persistence, science, and the love of a family could turn even the coldest silence into a voice demanding justice. When the gavel fell and Brian Holloway was sentenced to life without parole, it marked not just the end of a trial, but the close of a chapter that had haunted Daytona Beach for 14 years. Yet, even in justice, grief remained. Patricia returned home to the same porch she had illuminated every night since 2009. But now the light held a different meaning. No longer a beacon for Rachel's return, it became a flame of remembrance, a promise that her daughter's story would never fade into darkness. The community, too, found ways to honor Rachel. A scholarship was established in her name for nursing students, keeping alive the dreams she once wrote about in her diary. Each award carried her memory forward, ensuring her absence became a force for good. Beyond Daytona Beach, Rachel's case reverberated across Florida and the nation. Lawmakers cited it when expanding funding for cold case DNA testing, pointing to the jacket left in storage for over a decade as proof that no piece of evidence should ever be dismissed. Her story became a rallying cry for reform, a lesson written not just in sorrow, but in change. For Americans following the trial, Rachel Morgan's journey became more than local tragedy. It joined the canon of true crime cases that remind us of both human cruelty and resilience, the betrayal of a trusted neighbor, the devotion of a grieving family, and the power of science to restore a voice long silenced. As the waves of the Atlantic rolled endlessly onto the shore she once jogged, Rachel's legacy endured, not just in memory, but in action, reform, and hope. If you believe her story matters, if you want more families to find the light of justice, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0. And don't forget to subscribe because more stories wait in the shadows, and together, we'll bring them into the light.